Hello everyone, welcome to the fourth talk of the Koç University Center for Asian Studies talk series for the spring 2026 semester. Today we are very happy to host Professor Selçuk Esenbel. Professor Esenbel is Emeritus Professor of History at Boğaziçi University, and she is currently teaching Japanese history at Koç University. She received her PhD from Columbia University in 1981, and she is internationally recognized for her scholarship in Japanese history and Asian studies. Her work has been especially influential in exploring Japan's intellectual and historical connections with Turkey and the wider Turkic and Islamic world. Over the course of her career, she has also served as chair of the Department of History and as founding director of the Confucius Institute at Boğaziçi University. Professor Esenbel's talk today is titled Japanese Mirror on the Turkish World and Central Asia, Past and Present. After her presentation, we'll move to the Q&A session. Professor Esenbel, the floor is yours.
Thank you for this very complimentary introduction. I'm making a slight change. It's the Japanese mirror on the Turkish world and Central Asia, present and past. So we're going to start with today and trace ourselves back to the past, okay? Because I think that makes more sense at this point. And so I'm going to start with this illustration. I wonder if some people know who she is. Arfiye. Those of you doing international relations, current international relations of Japan, well, it's a good idea for you to immediately, investigate her biography. She's a fascinating, most interesting, individual, I would say. And let me just read briefly, okay, who she is. Arfiye is the parliamentary vice minister of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan. She was appointed in 2024 during the cabinet of Prime Minister Ishiba. She's a member of the Liberal Democrat ruling party, and she was elected to the House of Representatives from Kagoshima. Chisel that name into your mind. Kagoshima is very important in our talk. Okay, which is actually the prefecture in the southern island of Japan. It's known as Kyushu Island. As you will note, she's a lovely young woman. She's not Japanese. Actually, if you look at her biography, she's from a family of Uzbek and Uyghur marriage. Arfiye's name, as you can see, can be written in many languages. We have the Chinese and the Japanese and the Uzbek and the Uyghur. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, Ablat is her real surname, which is actually an Uyghur short version of Abdullah. Kind of like Muhammad to Mehmet. We shorten Muhammad to Mehmet, and it's that kind of a shortened term. She was born in Kitakyushu in Kagoshima. Her father and mother, they had immigrated to Japan sometime in the 1980s, and they were given Japanese citizenship. Now, I've met a couple of other Uzbek and Uyghurs who received Japanese citizenship very quickly during those years. So this is remarkable because Japan is very honest about its, concept of citizenship. It's certainly not ethnic. It's not stated as such in the Constitution, but ethnic origins and linguistic affinity is strongly recommended and required to become a citizen of Japan. I mean, it's not a very open immigrant society like the United States, for example, outwardly acknowledging that people can immigrate to the United States and become naturalized citizens. It's an exception to the rule. It's more similar to what the Germans think of citizenship, at least until recently, if not now. as opposed to the French idea of political citizenship, which is not, really that ethnic or racially oriented. So the fact that the family got citizenship is a point to consider. Then the father set up business in China. In other words, remember, this is the era of Deng Xiaoping, reasonably friendly, good relations, globalization, win-win situation. Let's make trade and not war. That atmosphere that, I wish we could go back to in some ways. But anyway, so Chinese and Japanese relations were reasonably, shall we say, harmonious, if not perfect. So father set up business in China, studied. In the meantime, he took the family back. So she studied in the Shanghai American School, and then the American International School in Guangzhou. And ultimately, her alma mater is actually my alma mater too. She's from Georgetown University, Foreign Service. For a while, she worked in the Bank of Japan, and then later on in the United Nations, assisting the Japanese permanent mission in the United Nations. The languages she knows Chinese, Japanese, Uzbek, Uyghur, English, Turkish of Turkey, Arabic. That's, as you can see, it's a pretty big, list. In her website, she openly declares that she's critical of authoritarianism, and that this is due, the reason why she's against authoritarianism is due to China's treatment of the Uyghur people. So she is there with a mission, very clearly stated mission. In terms of her, stance in Japanese society, she advocates diversity for Japanese society so that people like her, who are not ethnically Japanese, should be able to become Japanese citizens and enrich, shall we say, the profile, the portfolio of, contemporary Japan. Last year, in December 19 and 20, 2025, a major event took place in Tokyo. The summit of the Central Asia plus Japan dialogue. And this was the first time that this event also hosted the presidents, not just the foreign ministers or, diplomats, but also the presidents of the 5 independent republics of Central Asia. And here the presidents are standing with the current prime minister, Sanae Takaichi, or Takaichi Sanae, as we Japanese call her. It was a very successful meeting. The names of the presidents. The summit concluded with a $19 billion trade promise over the next 5 years, plus ODA grants for various issues to all of the states. I've just made a very cursory list of them: livestock, animal health, improvement, blood storage for hospitals, transportation equipment, and in collaboration with the UNDP, disaster risk reduction. In addition to that, contracts were signed, 150 contracts were signed for various investment, infrastructure, railroad improvement, and so on and so forth, for these 5 countries. Let's look at the principles of the summit, because it's important to read. Sometimes you might find it very boring to read the addresses of prime ministers, but foreign ministers, but they're important. Because usually those, speeches are very carefully calculated. Shall we use this word or that word? Shall we promise this or that? In other words, there is serious intellectual and conceptual preparation behind addresses. So even if they sound boring, read them, okay? So I read her speech opening the Tokyo Initiative, and she stresses fully the importance of Central Asia as a geopolitical connection between Europe and Asia. Very important to underline that. That Japan advocates industrial advance and diversification. The principle of a green economy and resilience economy. Resilience is a word that the Japanese like. What they mean here is that you know, we Japanese, we suffered through so many disasters. I mean, wars, atomic bomb, economic crises, and so on in our past. And somehow, one has to learn how to sort of survive. This would not be a term, for example, that an American politician would use, resilience. What do you mean resilience? Can do, will do, let's solve the problem would be the American, solution to the problem. But the Japanese, I mean, in English, it sounds a little artificial. But, the Japanese like this idea that despite disasters, the important thing is to survive and to resist further, shall we say, harm. Connectivity, human resource development, the Trans-Caspian International Transport Route, AI partnerships, and Japan. I've looked at Japan's, activities in Central Asia some years ago. I just had to refresh it, for your talk. Back in, about 10 years ago, I gave a class in the University of Göttingen, and it was about this topic. And so, I sort of have my materials from there. This was refreshed and, re-looked at for this talk. And you can see that, the Japanese, I find it interesting because people ask them saying, are you competing with China? Are you competing with Russia? They'll never say that. And they interviewed the president of Mitsubishi Company, and they said, well, China is building all these big railroads, one belt, one road, and, speedy train. And, it's going to really transform the logistics and transportation and communication between Eurasia. And then the president just looked and said, you know what? Somebody has to build it. I'm not going to build railroads, but if China wants to build it, he said, that's great. We'll use it, So in other words, the Japanese take is not to compete with China or with Russia doing the same things, but kind of circumventing around them and finding niches of investment, which maybe the Chinese ignored at this moment, or they're not interested in that geography, or that the Russians don't have at the moment the finances, to do it. So they find these, vacuum spots, if you will. They also emphasize, I think much more so than the Chinese, in my opinion, at least the way that I've checked, restoration of monuments. The Japanese are experts on Central Asian languages, cultures, important historic, monuments. I mean, if you want to know about the origins of the kind of, dyes that Central Asian, manuscript painters used in the Middle Ages, go to Japan. They know all of the original origins of the dyes that are used in the illustrations of the manuscripts and so forth. I mean, they're really experts in the region. And therefore, restoration of ancient documents, ancient monuments, ancient, sites and so on is part of their investment. Of course, human resources development. They invite students from all the 5, republics to study in Japan, and many are going, getting degrees and getting back home again, and then working with Japanese companies or Japanese, institutions and so forth, providing scholarships. And cooperation in health and medical fields means that actually lately, Japan started employing Uzbek women as nurses, especially for the elderly and also for the hospitals. So, I mean, if you ever go to Japan, don't be surprised. You might go to a hospital for some reason, and there might be an Uzbek lady there, who's doing sort of part of the medical work. Why they chose the Central Asians is a good question. And there are reasons for that. Why choose the Uzbek ladies, is a good question. And there, I guess, Japanese, cultural prioritization also gets into the picture. Artieri's role is in cultural diplomacy. She was very active during the summit. She gave one of the opening addresses, and she met with all the presidents in the airport in Uzbek national costume, and greeting them in their specific language. If it's Uzbek, Uzbek. If it's Kazakh, Kazakh. If it's, Turkmeni, it's Turkmeni, you know, the different Turkic languages. So she certainly plays a very visible cultural diplomacy role, if I may say so. In this photograph, please note the poster. I think this is very important. It's kind of like graphic art which represents a diplomatic idea, all right? And you have all the young women of the 5 Central Asian republics dressed in their national costume. And there's a young Japanese lady. There she is. They're holding hands, and she's in kimono. You know, this is very much also an emphasis on, you know, the Japanese like to do this. Let's preserve our traditional culture too. You know, we live very modern lives. We're very international lives. We're very westernized. They will admit to that. We're very westernized, but there should be moments where the traditional cultural image of the country surfaces. And inevitably, as in other countries in Asia, it's the women who represent this traditional image, like the Indian ladies in sari, or, you know, the Southeast Asian ladies in their traditional costumes. Sometimes you see them in photographs. In their day-to-day lives, you know, they wear, you know, modern fashions, but there are moments where they want to look, you know, very traditional culturally. And the Japanese certainly do that, you know, with the kimono. She greeted the Central Asian presidents in this second meeting, which was taking place simultaneously as the political meeting and the economic meeting was taking place. There was also the 14th Tokyo Dialogue of Central Asia plus Japan, dialogue on preservation of traditional culture. This is very Japanese cultural diplomacy. And its use, pragmatism, for industrial development at international activities. This is kind of like, right, there's a pragmatic reason why we preserve traditional culture, not for its own sake, but we can use it. She hosted also a group of Central Asian artists, artisans, and, you know, she organized many cultural activities with these cultural activists, you know, sort of like having them exhibit their art and so forth. So, in other words, the symposium or the summit also had a very strong kind of parallel cultural, shall we say, representation going on at that time. So, what's my take on this? I mean, I've been following RTA, as you can see, and by the way, I was shocked to discover I went to Ankara and I spoke to some people who ought to know about what's going on in the world, and they had no idea about this. It really disturbed me, honestly. But anyway, so be it. I'm sure that they'll find out very soon. To me, as a historian, of course, now I'm going to speak as a historian. This is post-war Japan finally returning to Central Asia. In 2004, actually, the return began. This is when the Liberal Democratic Party ruling elite of Japan, and this is my historian take, with Meiji roots, keep that in mind. In Japan's political elite, those parliamentarians elected to the Diet who have Meiji roots, family roots, have a cachet. They have one extra asset which helps their election. It's no guarantee, but in other words, the Meiji elite, in transformed, you know, version, survives in Japanese politics. Because please remember, Japan is, if not a name, in essence, it's a monarchy. Therefore, the aristocracy is no longer ruling, yes, but the families are there. And therefore, you know, it's very important to note that Abe Shinzo, the late Abe Shinzo, was unfortunately assassinated, as you know. He was a very sort of globally active, very energetic, you know, prime minister. I thought he was very interesting, to be honest with you. And he's the one responsible, by the way, for Marmara, right? So every time you take that metro, you know, Abe, thank you, basically. It was his initiative. He decided time has come for Japan to return back to Asia on its own, not as part of the US security alliance necessarily. Of course, informing the Americans, I'm sure, of what they're doing, at least 90%, if not 100%, you know. But, you know, it's time we return back to Asia. And edition. Why invest in Istanbul, for example? Let's turn back to Turkey. Let's return back to the Middle East on our own. He doesn't say this, but what he means is, like our previous political leadership did until 1945. Okay? And then the war intervened, defeat US security alliance, and so forth. So he's the one who initiated the Central Asia plus Japan program. In 2015, he visited all the Central Asian states and basically offered $27 billion worth of 4 different types of contracts, including ODA, trade, low interest credit, and so forth, to all of the countries. So that's pretty big money, you know, if you're going to get some kind of a low interest loan. Today, people would appreciate $27 billion. That's a lot of money for these 5 countries. He was the representative of the, I use the term conservative because everybody uses the term conservative, but I think it's a mistake. The Japanese never call themselves conservative. In fact, I don't believe that the term conservative is even similar Turkish political thinking in our country too. It's, the Japanese would say it's innovative right wing. That's their self-definition of what we call conservative politics, nationalist politics, or right-wing politics in our daily parlance. You know, they would say we are innovative right-wing. We're not just right-wing, you know, thinking about the past and just kind of imprisoning ourselves in the, you know, romantic sort of desire for some ancient, you know, utopia or something. We are innovative, we're futuristic, but we're right-wing. Kakushin Uyo is the Japanese term for that. And I think it's much more realistic, but I'm using the term conservative because everybody's using it and, you know, so on. So he's the descendant of a very important activist who participated in the wars of the Meiji Restoration. He comes from Choshu domain. Information like this in Japan is still valid. It's discreet, but it's valid. Oh, he comes from Choshu. I see. Whose grandson or granddaughter is he? From this family or that family, you know? He comes from the winning side. His uncle was a very controversial prime minister in the 1960s, Kishinobusuke, who was responsible for Japan's so-called miraculous industrial rise, 60s, and also the current US-Japan Security Treaty, which is a revised version of the 1952 treaty. In the political world, people will remember this. I see. So what's he going to be up to would be perhaps the question, you know. His partner in the cause, if you will, is Aso Taro. Aso Taro currently is the kingmaker of Japan. He's 85 years old, but he is the supporter of Takaichi, the female prime minister, okay? She is very nosebleeds, rather too feisty, I think, you know, sometimes in her language, especially concerning, you know, relations with China. And she seemed to be a go-getter. And she was surprisingly cool to Trump over the, you know, attack on Iran. Her statement simply said, problems like this should be solved in peace. She's supposed to be an ally of the United States. I'm surprised that Trump is not furious with her, you know, because she was very cool. It was sort of like very unfortunate, you know, that war has broken out. Problems like this should be solved in peace. That's pretty neutral. It's almost Scandinavian, you know, old Scandinavian neutrality. Well, she's supported by the Aso Taro faction in Japanese politics, who is the grandson of the prime minister who built post-war Japan. Everybody knows this, Yoshida Shigeru. And he was brought up by Yoshida. In fact, I'll be very honest with you. I'm at an age where I also share some personal information. I know him because, you know, we were friends in the 1960s in Tokyo. He was a little older than us, but occasionally we met and I don't know, you know, we had fun, you know, going to movies and stuff like that. It's just a college student. So he was studying in Stanford. Yoshida visited Stanford and was appalled at his Californian accent. immediately moved the boy from Stanford to Britain so that he would finish his education in the London School of Economics with a proper English accent instead of like these Americans in California, you know, that kind of a grandfather. Very, I mean, you know. So when he was prime minister, this is about 15 years ago, he came up with this idea, and he was very close and he was always working together, partner with Abe Shinzo. He was his foreign minister. And then when Abe, you know, passed away, then he became prime minister for a moment, you know, so it's kind of like he's shifted between top positions in Japanese politics. And he came up with this idea. He published it even. I have a copy of the book. It's thin like this, you know. Art of Freedom and Prosperity. It looks nice, you know, on the map. It's kind of like an arc. And it starts from Europe, this arc of freedom and prosperity. And it moves through Turkey. And then it doesn't go too much south. It strikes straight into Central Asia. And then it sort of like veers around China, if I may say so. And then, you know, ultimately arrives, you know, in Japan, including South Korea and so on. That's his, you know, I mean, politicians come up with ideas like this, you know, with concepts like this. And he, like Abe Shinzo, argued for the normalization of Japan, which means, you know, yes, we adhere to the US security alliance, but look, you know, this idea of a total pacifist constitution, of the idea of having been at the beck and call of the United States in the 60s and 70s, well, this is no longer going to be reality. We're going to be sort of acting quite independently on our own, but we're going to be a friend of the West. Now, I want to give you also a very minute information, which most people don't know. Japanese Christians are very important in the history of Japanese politics. They are a small group, and Japanese Christianity emerged in the 19th century when the religion was allowed. And they've become very important, especially in nationalist cum liberal, Gladstonian type of politics, you know, nationalist but liberal, believing in, you know, a liberal constitution, liberal economy, but nationalist. You know, this is not liberalism of today, but it's more like British liberalism of the 19th century, you know, that kind of liberalism. Japanese Christians tend to be nationalist liberals, and they have been important in Japanese politics. They don't publicize their Christian affiliation too much in politics because they don't want the Buddhists or the Shintoists, you know, to sort of react. And they're also comfortable with Shinto because they think Shinto is an ancient, you know, archaic Japanese, you know, tradition. It's not really a religion like, you know, that would sort of challenge your faith in the one God or something like that. It's kind of more like a folkloric national identity. So they will go to shrines, they will attend the ceremonies. But, you know, in this case, Yoshida was a Roman Catholic, and so is Asotaro, this kind of a Japanese Catholic. Keep that in mind, okay? It's an information that most textbooks just dismiss. They're not even aware of it. I happen to think it's important. He believed in expanding Japan's diplomatic horizons, a nationalist, innovative right wing, conservative, if you will. He advocates Europe-Asia connections, okay? And he is a descendant of even a more powerful Meiji kingmaker, the Minister of Interior, İçişleri Bakanı. And everybody says, oh, I see. So, you know, that kind of, you know, comment. He's also related to Ambassador Makino Nobuaki, who was the ambassador in Vienna, who tried very hard to negotiate an official treaty with the Ottoman Empire. This is back in the 1890s. So Makino was very, you know, energetic. He sent some people messages, this and that, and so on. It didn't work out, but, you know, he really believed that, you know, Ottoman Turkey and Meiji Japan should sign a treaty. So he sort of like had his mind to it. I'm also listing the names here of my sources, some of my sources, so you can kind of, you know, read about these people, on your own, their articles. Now, that's the present, okay? Now we're moving back. And I'm going to show you something, and you all are going to say, why are we looking at this image? Okay. This is a 9th century document. As you can see, rather deftly, beautifully written in classical Chinese by a Japanese nobleman who was the head of the Fujiwara clan, which is the most important clan connected to the imperial household, always, inheriting the role of being the chancellor, prime minister. We're talking Middle Ages now. Okay, I've suddenly taken you all the way back to the 9th century. And it's a list of the books that the family owns. All right? Whenever they went to China, they bought books, or maybe they were given as present. So the Fujiwara clan has had a remarkable library of medieval manuscripts and books from China. And this is the head of the clan who diligently made a list, like what we call today a catalog of the books that the family owns. This document actually presently is in the Imperial Household Agency. In other words, the Emperor of Japan owns it, all right? So we don't have access to it. And it's from this particular catalog, you can see the Hanzu there, of the Fujiwara Household Library. That's all very nice. The big question about this document, and maybe Burak will already recognize what I, will show here. Look at these two characters down here. Can you see it? In Japanese, we read it as Tokketsu. In Chinese, we read it as Tuzhe. In Turkish, it means Türk. And it refers to the Göktürks, the good old Göktürks. Remember? Humin Khan, İşlemi, and Kültekin, and all those guys that you read about, sometime in, I don't know, high school or someplace, you have some, I guess, the Orhon inscriptions, those guys, were responsible for the 8th century inscriptions in Ulaanbaatar. And it says, the Fujiwara family has one volume of Tuzhe language. Wow. It sounds great, right? If you're a Turkologist, you say, oh my God, Chinese have written a book on the Tuzhe language. This is not surprising because the Tang Emperor, Tang Taizong, he knew Tuzhe language. He was actually admired by the Tuzhe clans. He was called Altun Khan because he was related through his maternal line to, one of those families. Okay, so my friend Katayama has, devoted his whole life to searching for this book. He says, I started in my 20s. I'm now in my 80s. I'm going all over Japan. I'm trying to find this book. I'm desperate. But we don't have the book. We have a list of the book, but we don't have the book. Maybe it was only one copy, so it surely might have been destroyed or something like that. Most likely, I don't know what happened. Maybe it's still in some drawer someplace. You never know about things like that. But the important thing is, even if we don't have the book, we know that the Fujiwara clan elites knew that there were Turks and that they had a language of their own. They were interested, so they got this book and they probably, kind of went through it and said, so this is what it is. In other words, the knowledge of the existence of the Turkic nomad peoples in North Asia is already embedded in Japanese elite, shall we say, knowledge, even before the modern period. In other words, if you ask somebody in the street, and if they are of high education and say, do you know anything about Tuzhe? Oh, yeah, I think there's some, tribal people living in North China or something like that. And they have their own language. I mean, at least they could give you these couple of sentences, all right? They would know roughly the location and so on. The imperial family today has more than 8,000 items from medieval China and medieval Asia. This is part of the royal treasury, and I'm just showing you one of those items. It's from Central Asia. a beautiful instrument, as you can see, with a mother of pearl illustration in it of, some trader who's not Chinese, who's not Japanese, of Central Asia. So modern Japanese quickly developed the field of Turkology, the study of Turkic peoples in the 19th century. And one reason is because they already knew that they existed, okay? I'll be honest with you, most Turkish people in the Ottoman Empire didn't know that they come from the Alpine Mountains, or they spoke a very different language back then, and all of that information. It's the product of European scholarship of the 19th century that the Turkish people learned about the details of their archaic, shall we say, connections, if any, to East Asia. So modern age Japan discovers Altaic languages from European scholarship, and they say, since they know those people already. And it's the founder of Oriental history in Tokyo University, Shiratori Kurokichi is his name, who advocated the study of Mongolian, Turkic, tribal, nomad history, which might explain the continental roots of the Japanese people. This is how they took it. Well, if our languages are maybe affiliated, we don't know that. But that means that, we know that we migrated from North Asia at some point, So maybe studying these people today and their history will give us some hints about, the origins of the Japanese people. I mean, it's a speculative thesis. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was proven, but it's one of the many theses about, the origins of ancient Japanese people. And it already begins in the 19th century in the top, Imperial University of Tokyo, and this professor is saying, let's invest in it, let's study these languages and so forth. Another individual in the 19th century, Count Otani Kozui, who's an abbot of a Buddhist sect, which is very popular, very traditional in Japan to this date. It's centered in Kyoto. It's called the True Pure Land Buddhist sect. In other words, one of the most important, popular sects of Buddhism of Japanese society. He was the abbot. He organized expeditions to Central Asia in the year 1900s. His motive: to discover the Central Asian roots of Japan's Buddhism. Another again, Shiratori is saying, well, maybe we will discover the roots of who we were. And Otani is saying, maybe we will discover the roots of our religion, our most important spiritual religion, Buddhism, which we adopted from China and Korea back in the Middle Ages, but it originated somewhere in Central Asia, which is true. So maybe we'll discover some connections there, through the history of religion itself. In the meantime, his expedition also collected a lot of information about the ethnic communities, the publications, manuscripts, even artwork of 19th century people living in Central Asia. And right now it's in Ryukoku University in Kyoto. We don't have it, but they have, okay? Finally, Yamada Torajiro, the merchant that I study, and the book that I translated into Turkish, Torukogakan, which means Illustrated Observations of Turkey, that was published in 1911, shows, because that's the first chapter in the book, I was quite surprised to discover that Yamada knew about all of this. He read his Chinese histories. He read the Tang history, Tangshu, or the Suishu. He knew about, there are these Tuzhe people, or Tokketsu in Japanese. So his first chapter is about these people living in the Ottoman Empire today, who call themselves Turk in Istanbul. They actually, their ancestors came from the Altai Mountains, and gives us a very, correct, brief narrative. The oddest point here for you to remember is nobody in Turkey knows that, but the Japanese do. In other words, in 1911, very few people know about, the Altai Mountains, there are some translations from French publications about the Orhon, inscriptions, the names of the khans and so on. This is not general public knowledge, but the Japanese knew. And this guy is not a scholar, he's a merchant. Yes, educated, but he's a merchant, So he has access to that information. He can easily write it in his book, quite easily. So, in other words, this is our Count Oltanikosi. He also believed in the development of Asia. He was an Asianist. He was an agronomist. He believed in agriculture. He invested in the Republic of Turkey later on in the 1920s. Now, where does all of this start from? And where does it lead to? Is the second question, because the summit in Tokyo last year is obviously a geopolitical vision. It's not a Buddhist vision. It's not a linguistic vision, but I'm sure that these linguistic Buddhist, elements probably contribute to this awareness, if you will, this consciousness of the importance of the region. And it starts with Baron Nishi Tokujiro. I'm going to now talk about top gun strategists of Japan in the 19th century. A couple of individuals who began all this, and they practiced it. They put it to use. It's not just an intellectual idea. He is Baron Nishi Tokujiro, ambassador in St. Petersburg. And on his return back to Japan, he traveled through Central Asia. He went all the way to Xinjiang. He then later on wrote a memoir, which was a report to the government. And, I've looked at it briefly, and some people have studied it. And he negotiated the treaties with Russia. This is also very important. And there he says, we have to befriend the non-Russian peoples of Central Asia because they're kind of frustrated. They don't seem to have any love lost for the, Tsarist regime. And, remember, this is the time that the Russians are, conquering the Khanates. And he says, as the Japanese, maybe we should sort of like extend a friendly arm to them. Let's make friends with these people. We might collaborate with them in the future. He is the one who originated this idea. Okay. So if you're going to blame somebody, blame Nishi. All right. Of the 19th century. My young colleague from Ankara University, whose book you should read, it's available in Turkish. He skipped to the 1920s when how all of this translates itself in Japanese politics. And you're not going to believe this. I mean, I've studied that period too, and I know many, Turkic Islamic organizations that the Japanese have established in the 20s and the 30s, obviously for their imperial strategy, you're doing it. But they even established, can you believe this, a Panturan society? I mean, I think this is wild, In Tokyo, there was an official Panturan society founded by a Japanese Imaoka who really believes in Panturan. The guy believes in it, and a Tatar intellectual who emigrated to Hungary after the 1917 revolution in Russia, who was actually a close associate of Zeki Bey Diplomat. And a Hungarian, a Hungarian Panturanist intellectual. So one Hungarian, one Tatar emigre, one Japanese, they established the Panturan Society, which is very active until 1945. They hold conferences, they do this, they do that. I mean, how many Panturan societies do you have around the world anyway? I mean, but it just shows you this, Japanese take on what was happening. And this is from Nishi Tokujiro's report that I told you about. It was published in 1886. It was classified. Now it's no longer classified. And he says, conflict around Ili, the Chinese characters are there, is of pivotal importance of the Xinjiang region for the relations between the Russian Empire and the Chinese Empire, and by proxy, everybody else. So it's the Ili region, which he is, pointing out to. And the Japanese Foreign Ministry, the Imperial Army is going to send many agents to the Ili region. We're going to learn the languages, make friends, write reports, and so on. This is going to go through 1900s, 1920s, 1930s, but it begins with Bushi. Now, this is another jet. General Utsunomiya, who was the chief of the second bureau of the General Staff of the Imperial Army. That's, Erkan-ı Harbiye'nin, basically istihbarat kısmının başkanı, all right? And he's the one who originated next. This is turn of the 20th century, the strategy that he says this. I read his memoirs. He says, we need to befriend, picking up on Nishi, the Turkic peoples, the Muslim peoples of Eurasia. He's thinking even bigger, like, Middle East, maybe North Africa, Central Asia, and probably parts of China, especially where, non-Han peoples live. And he says, we have to befriend them for the empire, Japanese empire. So he invited, hosted, protected Tatar emigres, Uyghur emigres, Chinese Muslims, even an Egyptian captain, an Indian pan-Islamist activist. They are all in Tokyo in the 1910s, okay? And they are doing cultural activity, intellectual activity, and they are being hosted and supported by the General Staff of the Imperial Army, all right? He even, in his diary, he records how much money he gives to whom. So this is obviously geopolitical strategy in action, not in theory anymore. He even, you can read this on your own, but he even wrote a proposal to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan saying, let's sign a treaty with the Ottoman Empire because the Sultan is the Caliph of the world of Islam. So typical strategic thinking. If we befriend the Caliph of Islam, who becomes pro-Japanese, that means all Muslims of the world will be our friend, right? And he has a list of the advantages of a treaty with Turkey. What I love most, you can read this on your own, is he says, well, why don't we send some, Japanese immigrants to the fertile agricultural land of Mesopotamia and Asia Minor? Some Japanese farmers, because this is the period, this is in the 1900s, that Japan starts sending millions of people to South America as farmers. So he says, we can send them to the Ottoman Empire. Why not, So we would have had these Japanese, farmers in Southeast Turkey, maybe, if all of this had taken place. This is his diary, and there's a sentence here that I'm gonna, paraphrase for you from the original Japanese. I think it's very important. He says, why am I doing all this? It's because, he says, I need these Muslim activists to use in Japan's future against Japan's clash with the Christian countries. He wants to use that classic Islamic idea, the stereotype of the warrior Muslim, clashing with Islam ever since, the Middle Ages, the Crusaders idea, turning it upside down and says, I want to be partners with them. Because in the future, he predicts, this is in 1910, he predicts, in 1910, Japan is a friend of the West, by the way, Anglo-Japanese alliance. But the general says, in the future, it's inevitable. We're going to clash with the Western powers in Asia. He means Britain, probably France, and maybe Holland. Says we'll need these people because they have this traditional, competition with the world of Christianity. So we need their energy, we need their, activism and so forth. So that's his rationalization, right, for this policy. This is the Egyptian captain whom he supported in Tokyo at this time. The captain is of Turkish origins, of course, because he's in the Egyptian army. He was a pan-Islamist. He didn't like the British, and he kept publishing, articles in Tokyo against the British Empire, and the general is funding it, basically. Finally, a mysterious but quite resourceful colonel, as you can see in this, sort of lovely Japanese, illustration. He is Colonel Fukushima Yasumasa, who was the military attaché in Berlin. And he decided, he got permission to right through Eurasia from the Russian Empire, from Berlin to Vladivostok on horseback, all by himself. Actually, this is nothing new. Longberry had already done it, almost 20, years ago. And many British, officers have ridden through Central Asia on horseback before that. But he wants to make a name for Japan. So he does this. He will be the head of Asian intelligence during the Russo-Japanese War, even organizes some operations here in the summer against the Russians. All right, so let's look at what he says. I read his memoirs again. He was very popular, the public loved him and so on, a kind of hero of his day. So what I find fascinating with these people is that they're very, merciless strategists, but they also have this kind of romantic vision. It's very 19th century, I think. You romanticize in literature your geopolitical vision. You see this a lot in, Russian military and civilian leadership of the time, even Ottoman, I would say. Harsha Ram, who's an important, literary expert of this kind of poetry, calls it the poetry of literature. It's sort of poetry that expresses geopolitical strategy and political vision. So I'm reading to you his poetry in translation. He says, I was just going through, the top sort of hills of the Altai Mountains, and he was in a snowstorm, okay? Probably he couldn't see anything, I can imagine. Oh, you Altai, though said to be on the top of the world according to geography, you are under my foot. Indeed, I'm higher than you by many feet. Our motherland in the land of the sun, should it stop in the sea, 5,000 kilometers afar beyond the continent of Asia? Rhetorical question. Maybe we should be here. So, I mean, this is really an expression of that, imperial vision about the importance of the Altai Mountains, Central Asia, the peoples there, and so forth. Final point. There are many events in pre-1945 Japan's history where the Japanese intelligence, army, friends, if you will, of this region that we're talking about, were involved in many overt and covert activities. So this is no fun. We're not talking about just intellectual history for its own sake. And this is one event that they were discreetly involved in, and that was the famous East Turkestan Islamic Republic Rebellion of 1933, which is also known as the Kumul and Kashgar Rebellion. And this is from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan. A diplomat who's just, drawn hastily a map of where the, forces, the rebels are located, the names of their commanders, and he has written a report to the authorities about what's going on there, okay? We know that the Japanese, they were not there directly, but they indirectly supported this rebellion. Maybe other people did too. So one conclusion that I find in all of this is the Japanese, others probably, other global powers also, or those who claim that they are global power, probably start using the same technique and strategy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Japanese are using transnational networks for all of this imperial strategy. These are people who are usually in exile because of the tumultuous, wars of the early 20th century, like World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution. They are members of a diaspora, who are usually stateless, but they've had to, be refugees here and there. So the Japanese are picking up people from there. And one very illustrious personality that they picked up was actually the grandson of Abdülhamit II. The Şehzade, or the Ottoman Prince Abdülkerim Efendi, was living in Damascus in exile with his father and family. And somehow they contacted him and they convinced him to come to Japan to wait for the opportunity if the, East Turkestan rebellion is victorious, this is not all of Japan, but I know some of the politicians and the generals who really thought that they could do this, And we're in 1933. They've just occupied Manchuria. And remember, they've just put an last emperor of the Qing dynasty on the throne. So they're thinking exactly the same thing. They tell them, if this is militarily successful, we're going to fly you to Urumqi, and we will declare you to be the Sultan of Turkestan. How's that? Well, I guess he was naive enough that he thought this would work out. So he did come to, Tokyo. It created tremendous problems with the Turkish embassy, which didn't like this at all. And besides, the Soviet Union occupied Xinjiang, and that was the end of, the rebellion by 1936. But I'm going to finish the story here so that you understand it begins with a kind of cultural interest, some kind of, awareness. Oh, these people are living here, And then it's bolstered with, idea of historical study, linguistic study, religious study of the region, and it ends up fertilizing an imperial geopolitical strategy. What I'm saying is what's happening now in Japan is a benign version. It's a benign version. I'm not saying that the Japanese are going to be imperialists or something, but they are using this know-how. They're using it. They revived it because, know-how never disappears. Once you've written a report about something, even if it gathers dust, somebody will come and blow the dust, start reading the pages and say, this is exactly what we need to do. So Abe and Aso have done their homework. And the employment of this Uzbek Uyghur girl given citizenship of Japan, I think is a remarkable, sort of strategy to make an entry into the platform of, Japanese strategy, political vision about what they think, Central Asia and Inner-Asia in this case, her Uyghur origins also contributes to their competition with China, I think. So in other words, what my sense is that this pre-1945 know-how has been refreshed and reread again and speak put to use. Okay?
I think all of you will agree that this has been a fascinating talk, extremely informative and insightful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Esenbel, for this highly informative and insightful talk. Thank you all for participating and assisting with the